The sledgehammer crashed through the concrete one final time as Sarah Mitchell wiped sweat from her brow, staring at the demolished remains of her backyard pool. She'd finally done it, reclaimed her property from the nightmare that had consumed her life for 3 years. But as she turned toward her house, triumphant and exhausted, her blood ran cold. Karen Pemberton stood at the fence line, phone pressed to her ear, her face twisted with rage. "Yes, officer, she's destroying property values and violating city ordinances. You need to arrest her now!" What Karen didn't know was that Sarah had been planning this moment for months, and the real surprise was just beginning. The morning, sun cast long shadows across the Riverside Heights subdivision as Sarah Mitchell raised the sledgehammer above her head one final time. The 20-pound tool felt lighter now than it had 6 hours ago when she'd begun her demolition project. Sweat dripped from her forehead onto the cracked concrete below, each drop a testament to the physical and emotional toll of this moment. "Come on, you bastard!" she muttered through gritted teeth, targeting the last stubborn section of pool coping that had refused to yield. The sledgehammer connected with a satisfying crack that echoed through the quiet neighborhood, sending chunks of concrete flying across her backyard. She stepped back, chest heaving, and surveyed her handiwork. Where once stood an elegant in-ground swimming pool, the kind that graced magazine covers and real estate brochures, now lay a crater filled with broken concrete, twisted rebar, and 3 years of accumulated rage. The turquoise water that had once sparkled invitingly was long gone, pumped out and replaced with the debris of destruction. "Sarah! Sarah!" The shrill voice cut through the morning air like a rusty blade. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Sarah didn't need to turn around to know who was screaming. Karen Pemberton's voice had become as familiar as her own heartbeat over the past 3 years, and just as unwelcome. But she turned anyway, sledgehammer still gripped in her hands, and faced her neighbor across the pristine white fence that separated their properties. Karen stood there in her perfectly pressed tennis outfit, her blonde hair styled in the same rigid bob she'd maintained since moving to Riverside Heights 5 years ago. Her face was flushed with indignation, her manicured hands planted firmly on her hips in a pose that had become her signature stance of disapproval. "I'm removing my pool," Sarah said simply, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "On my property, which last I checked is still legal in this country." "Legal?" Karen's voice pitched higher, reaching frequencies that made neighborhood dogs start barking. "Legal! You're destroying the aesthetic integrity of our entire neighborhood. Do you have any idea what you've done to property values?" Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the same suffocating feeling that had plagued her every interaction with Karen since the day she'd moved in next door. But today, something was different. Today, she felt free. "I know exactly what I've done," Sarah replied, setting the sledgehammer down and pulling off her work gloves. "I've removed an eyesore from my backyard, a constant reminder of the worst day of my life." "Eyesore?" Karen's eyes widened with theatrical horror. "That was a beautiful pool, designed by the same architect who did the Hendersons on Maple Street. It was featured in Better Homes and Gardens, for Christ's sake. And now it's gone." Sarah's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the surface. "Just like everything else that mattered to me 3 years ago." Karen's expression shifted, her outrage momentarily replaced by something that might have been confusion. For a brief second, Sarah wondered if her neighbor might actually ask about what happened 3 years ago, if she might show even a flicker of human compassion. Instead, Karen's face hardened again. "I don't care about your personal problems, Sarah. What I care about is the fact that you've just destroyed a $40,000 improvement to this neighborhood without even consulting the HOA board. The HOA has no authority over in-ground pools," Sarah said, her patience wearing thin. "I checked multiple times. I have every right to modify my own property as I see fit, as long as it doesn't violate city ordinances." "We'll see about that." Karen pulled out her phone with the speed of a gunslinger drawing in an old Western movie. "I'm calling the police." Sarah laughed, actually laughed for the first time in months. "The police? For what exactly? Destroying my own property?" vandalism, destruction of property, creating a public nuisance, violating city ordinances. Karen was already dialing, her fingers flying across the screen. There are laws about this sort of thing, you know. Yes, Karen, I know. I've spent the last 6 months researching every applicable law, ordinance, and regulation. I've pulled permits, filed the appropriate paperwork, and followed every single rule to the letter. Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction as she watched doubt flicker across Karen's face. But please, by all means, call the police. I'm sure they'll be fascinated by your interpretation of property rights. Karen's finger hovered over the call button, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. For a moment, Sarah thought her neighbor might actually back down, might realize how ridiculous she sounded. Then Karen's eyes narrowed, and Sarah saw something dangerous flicker there, the look of someone who had never been told no and wasn't about to start accepting it now. You think you're so smart, don't you? Karen's voice dropped to a venomous whisper. You think you can just do whatever you want, consequences be damned. Well, let me tell you something, Sarah Mitchell. This neighborhood has standards. Standards that people like you seem incapable of understanding. People like me? Sarah's voice remained steady, but something cold settled in her stomach. What exactly does that mean, Karen? You know exactly what it means. Karen's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. People who can't afford to maintain their properties. People who drag down the whole neighborhood with their problems. The word hung in the air between them like a loaded weapon. Sarah felt the familiar rage building in her chest, the same rage that had sustained her through 3 years of Karen's passive-aggressive comments, her HOA complaints, her constant surveillance of Sarah's every move. But today, the rage felt different. Today, it felt powerful. My problems? Sarah stepped closer to the fence, close enough to see the tiny lines around Karen's eyes that her expensive concealer couldn't quite hide. You want to talk about my problems, Karen? Let's talk about them. Karen's phone was at her ear now, the call connecting. Yes, hello? I need to report a disturbance in Riverside Heights. My neighbor is destroying property and 3 years ago, Sarah continued, her voice rising to carry over Karen's conversation. My 5-year-old daughter drowned in that pool. Emma. Her name was Emma, and she loved to swim. She was going to be on the swim team at school this year. Karen's words faltered, her eyes widening as she realized what Sarah was saying. She slipped and hit her head on the diving board. The same diving board you complimented when you first moved in. The same pool you've spent 3 years telling me I should use more often because it's such a waste of a beautiful feature. Sarah, Karen's voice was barely a whisper now, the phone still pressed to her ear. I couldn't bring myself to fill it in right away. I thought maybe, someday, I'd be able to look at it without seeing her floating face down in the deep end, without hearing her last breath bubbling up through the water. Sarah's voice cracked, but she pushed on. But you know what I realized today, Karen? I realized that keeping that pool was like keeping a grave in my backyard, and I'm done living in a cemetery. The phone slipped from Karen's hand, clattering against the fence before tumbling to the ground. Her face had gone pale, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Ma'am? Ma'am, are you there? The tinny voice of the 911 operator drifted up from the fallen phone. Ma'am, what's your emergency? Sarah looked at her neighbor, really looked at her, and saw something she'd never seen before in Karen's perfectly composed features. Shame. Raw, undiluted shame. You should probably tell them never mind, Sarah said quietly. Unless you really want to explain to the police why you called them because your neighbor removed a pool where her daughter died. Karen's hands shook as she picked up the phone. I'm sorry, she whispered into the receiver. False alarm. Everything's fine. But even as Karen ended the call, Sarah could see that her neighbor wasn't finished. The shame was already fading, from her eyes being replaced by something harder, more calculating. Karen Pemberton didn't back down from anything, even when she was clearly in the wrong. I'm sorry about your daughter, Karen said, her voice regaining some of its earlier composure. I really am. But that doesn't give you the right to destroy property values for the entire neighborhood. That pool was a selling point for every house on this street. Sarah stared at her neighbor in disbelief. Are you serious right now? I just told you my daughter died in that pool, and you're worried about property values? Look, I understand you're grieving, but no. Sarah's voice cut through Karen's words like a blade. You don't understand anything. You never have. You see everything in terms of profit margins and property assessments. You've never seen the human cost of your obsession with perfection. That. Sarah was barely awake, still wrapped in her bathrobe and nursing her first cup of coffee, when the doorbell rang with the persistence of someone who had no intention of being ignored. Through the frosted glass of her front door, she could see multiple figures standing on her porch. Mrs. Mitchell? The voice was crisp, official, and carried the weight of authority. City Building Inspector's Office. We need to speak with you about unpermitted construction activities on your property. Sarah's stomach dropped as she opened the door to find 3 men in matching polo shirts bearing the city logo, clipboards in hand, and serious expressions on their faces. Behind them, barely visible but unmistakably present, Karen Pemberton stood on her own front porch, arms crossed and wearing the satisfied smile of someone watching their plan unfold perfectly. The lead inspector, a middle-aged man with graying temples and tired eyes, stepped forward. I'm Inspector Rodriguez. We received a complaint yesterday about unauthorized demolition work. We're going to need to see your permits. Of course. Sarah's voice remained steady despite the adrenaline spike coursing through her system. She'd been expecting this, had been prepared for it since the moment Karen made her threat. Please, come in. She led the 3 men through her house to the kitchen, where she'd already prepared a manila folder containing every document related to her pool demolition. Permits, environmental assessments, contractor licenses, soil reports, drainage plans, 6 months of meticulous preparation spread across her dining room table like evidence in a courtroom. Inspector Rodriguez's eyebrows rose as he examined the paperwork. His 2 colleagues flanked him, their expressions shifting from skeptical to surprised as they reviewed document after document. This is thorough, Rodriguez admitted, flipping through the permits. Swimming pool removal permit, environmental impact assessment, soil stability report. He looked up at Sarah with something approaching respect. Most homeowners don't go to this level of detail for a simple pool removal. I wanted to make sure everything was done correctly, Sarah replied, her tone neutral. I know how important it is to follow proper procedures. Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, the younger inspector spoke up, his voice gentler than his colleagues. Why remove such an expensive pool? These records show it was only 8 years old. Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest, but this time it was accompanied by something else. A growing anger at being forced to repeatedly justify her choice to eliminate the site of her daughter's death. Personal reasons, she said simply. Rodriguez nodded, apparently satisfied with that response. He made a few notes on his clipboard before looking back at Sarah. Everything appears to be in order here. Your permits are valid, the work was performed by licensed contractors, and all safety protocols were followed. So there's no violation? Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. No violation, Rodriguez confirmed. Though I have to ask, the complaint we received suggested that the demolition was done overnight without proper notification. The caller seemed quite insistent that laws had been broken. Sarah glanced toward her front window, where she could still see Karen, lurking on her porch. I began work at 6 a.m., which is within the allowable hours for construction activities according to city noise ordinances. The work was completed by 2 p.m. the same day, all within the legal time frame. And you notified your immediate neighbors? The third inspector asked, consulting his own notes. I sent certified letters to every house within a 2-block radius 3 weeks ago, informing them of the planned demolition date. Sarah pulled out another set of documents from her folder. Here are the delivery confirmations. Rodriguez whistled low under his breath. Mrs. Mitchell, in 15 years of doing this job, I've never seen a homeowner more prepared for an inspection. Most people can barely find their permits, let alone provide certified notification records. I like to be thorough, Sarah repeated, but there was steel in her voice now. Especially when I know someone is looking for reasons to cause me trouble. The three inspectors exchanged glances, and Sarah could see understanding pass between them. They'd clearly dealt with vindictive neighbors before. Well, everything here is in perfect order, Rodriguez said, closing his clipboard with a decisive snap. We'll file our report and close this complaint. If you have any issues with future complaints, don't hesitate to call our office directly. As Sarah walked the inspectors to her front door, she caught sight of Karen's face across the yard. Her neighbor's satisfied expression had transformed into something closer to panic as she watched the city officials shake Sarah's hand and leave, without issuing any citations or violations. The moment the inspector's van pulled away, Karen was marching across her perfectly manicured lawn towards Sarah's front door, her face flushed with indignation. How? Karen demanded without preamble, her voice shrill enough to wake the entire neighborhood. How did you get permits for that? I checked. Pool demolition requires environmental impact studies, soil stability reports, drainage assessments, all of which I completed and filed with the appropriate departments, Sarah interrupted, enjoying the look of dawning horror on her neighbor's face. 6 months ago. 6 months? Karen's voice cracked. You've been planning this for 6 months? I've been planning this since the day you moved in and started your campaign to control every aspect of my life, Sarah corrected. But it took me a while to work up the courage to actually go through with it. Karen's face cycled through several emotions before settling on rage. You did this to spite me. You destroyed a beautiful pool just to get back at me. I destroyed a pool where my daughter died because I was tired of living with a constant reminder of the worst day of my life, Sarah said, her patience finally wearing thin. The fact that it also happens to irritate you is just a bonus. You can't just... This isn't... Karen sputtered, her usual composure completely shattered. There have to be other regulations, other departments. Feel free to call them all, Sarah said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I have permits and approval from the building department, the environmental services department, the public works department, and the homeowners association, though that last one wasn't actually required. Karen's face went pale. The HOA approved this? Unanimously, Sarah lied smoothly, enjoying the way Karen's eyes widened in shock. It turns out that when you explain to people that you're removing a pool where your child died, they tend to be more understanding than you might expect. Actually, Sarah had never bothered to consult the HOA because pool removal didn't require their approval. But Karen didn't need to know that. Let her wonder which of her neighbors had voted against her interests. This isn't over, Karen said, but her voice lacked the conviction it had carried the day before. There are other ways to deal with neighbors who won't cooperate with community standards. Such as? Sarah asked, genuinely curious about what her neighbor's next move might be. Karen's smile returned, sharp and predatory. You'll see, and when you do, you'll realize that you picked the wrong fight with the wrong person. As Karen stalked back to her house, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her neighbor's threats weren't empty posturing. Karen Pemberton was the type of woman who didn't accept defeat gracefully, and she clearly had more weapons in her arsenal than city inspectors. Sarah's instincts proved correct when the next attack came just 2 days later. She was working in her front garden, planting new flowers to fill the beds that had been neglected during her years of grief, when a sleek black sedan pulled up to her curb. 2 people emerged, a woman in an expensive suit carrying a briefcase, and a man with a camera who immediately began taking pictures of Sarah's house. Mrs. Mitchell? The woman's voice was professionally pleasant but carried an underlying threat. I'm Janet Holbrook from Holbrook & Associates. We represent the Riverside Heights Homeowners Association. I understand you've made some significant modifications to your property recently. Sarah's blood ran cold. The HOA, the same organization she'd told Karen had approved her pool removal, was now standing on her doorstep with a lawyer and a photographer. Her lie had somehow become a reality check she wasn't prepared for. I'm not sure what you mean, Sarah said carefully, setting down her gardening trowel but remaining kneeled by her flower bed. The removal of your swimming pool, Holbrook clarified, consulting a tablet she'd pulled from her briefcase. According to our records, such modifications require prior approval from the Architectural Review Committee. Pool removal isn't listed as a restricted activity in the HOA covenant, Sarah replied, grateful for the hours she'd spent reading every page of the neighborhood's governing documents. In-ground pools themselves require approval before installation, but removal isn't mentioned. Holbrook's smile tightened. I'm afraid you're operating under an outdated interpretation of our guidelines. The Architectural Review Committee has expanded its oversight to include any modifications that could impact the overall aesthetic coherence of the neighborhood. When was this change made? Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. The emergency vote was held yesterday evening, Holbrook said, confirming Sarah's suspicions. Given the urgency of the situation, the board felt it necessary to clarify existing regulations. Marcus Davidson had been practicing law for 23 years, and in that time, he'd seen every variety of neighbor dispute, HOA power grab, and suburban warfare imaginable. But as he sat across from Sarah Mitchell in his mahogany-paneled office, reviewing the documents she'd brought him, even he was impressed by the audacity of what Karen Pemberton had orchestrated. They held an emergency HOA meeting without proper notice to all residents, he said, adjusting his reading glasses as he studied the meeting minutes. They voted to retroactively change architectural guidelines to target a specific property modification, and they're demanding you rebuild a pool where your child died. He looked up at Sarah with the expression of a man who'd found a particularly interesting puzzle. Mrs. Mitchell, in 2 decades of practice, I've never seen an HOA overreach this, brazenly illegal. Sarah felt a surge of vindication mixed with grim satisfaction. So they broke the law? Multiple laws, Davidson confirmed, spreading the documents across his desk like evidence in a murder trial. Texas Property Code requires 72 hours written notice for emergency HOA meetings. They gave residents 18 hours via email, and only to selected board members, not the general membership. The retroactive rule change violates due process protections under state law. And demanding you rebuild a structure for purely aesthetic reasons could constitute intentional infliction of emotional distress given the circumstances of your daughter's death. What are my options? Davidson's smile was the kind that defense attorneys dreaded seeing across a courtroom. We destroy them, completely and thoroughly, and we make sure they never try something like this again. Sarah leaned forward in her chair. What do you need from me? Everything. Every document, every conversation, every interaction you've had with Karen Pemberton and the HOA board over the past 3 years. I want a complete timeline of harassment, intimidation, and regulatory abuse. Davidson pulled out a yellow legal pad and began making notes. And I want you to prepare yourself for war, because this is going to get ugly before it gets better. It's already ugly, Sarah replied. They want me to rebuild the place where Emma died. How much uglier can it get? Davidson's expression grew serious. Mrs. Mitchell, when we file suit against the HOA and Mrs. Pemberton personally, they're going to fight back with everything they have. They'll try to paint you as an unstable, grieving mother who's lashing out at innocent neighbors. They'll dig into your personal life, your finances, your mental health history. They'll make you into the villain of this story if they can. Sarah thought about the past 3 years, the sleepless nights, the therapy sessions, the medication that had barely kept her functional enough to go through the motions of living. Karen and her allies would have plenty of ammunition if they wanted to portray her as mentally unstable, but they would also have to explain why they thought it was appropriate to torment a grieving mother for 3 years over lawn maintenance and hedge trimming. Let them try, Sarah said quietly. I'm done hiding from what happened to Emma. I'm done pretending that my grief is something to be ashamed of. And I'm definitely done letting Karen Pemberton dictate how I'm allowed to heal. Davidson nodded, approvingly. Good, because we're going to need that strength for what comes next. The first shot in the legal war came exactly 1 week later, delivered by certified mail to every house in Riverside Heights. The letter, printed on Davidson & Associates letterhead, was a masterpiece of legal intimidation wrapped in polite language. Dear Riverside Heights residents, our office represents Sarah Mitchell in a matter concerning recent actions taken by your homeowner association board. We have filed suit in Travis County District Court challenging the legality of the HOA's emergency meeting held on date, the retroactive rule changes implemented at that meeting, and the subsequent demand that Mrs. Mitchell rebuild a swimming pool where her 5-year-old daughter tragically drowned in 2022. If you attended or participated in the aforementioned emergency meeting, you may be contacted as part of our investigation into potential violations of Texas property code, civil rights statutes, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We encourage any residents who have concerns about the HOA board's conduct to contact our office directly. The letter detonated through the neighborhood like a carefully placed explosive charge. Sarah was working in her garden when she heard the first eruption of outrage from Karen's backyard. Her neighbor's voice carried clearly across the fence, shrill with panic as she spoke rapid fire into her phone. What do you mean they're suing us personally? The HOA has insurance for this kind of thing. What do you mean intentional infliction? Of emotional distress? We were protecting property values? More voices joined the chorus over the next hour, as word spread from house to house. Sarah could hear fragments of panicked conversations drifting across yards and through windows as her neighbors discovered they might be personally liable for what they'd thought was a simple HOA enforcement action. The best part, Sarah realized, as she listened to the growing chaos, was that most of them had no idea what they'd actually voted for. Karen had manipulated them into supporting her vendetta without explaining that they were demanding a grieving mother rebuild the site of her child's death. Sarah's phone began ringing at 6 p.m. sharp. Mrs. Mitchell, this is Bob Henderson from Maple Street. I need to talk to you about this lawsuit business. Sarah recognized Henderson's voice. He was the HOA treasurer and one of Karen's closest allies on the board. He'd also been one of the people who'd voted to demand she rebuild her pool. What can I do for you, Mr. Henderson? Look, I think there might have been some miscommunication about this whole pool situation. Karen said you were just trying to avoid property maintenance, but this lawyer letter says, well, it says your daughter. Henderson's voice trailed off uncomfortably. Drowned in the pool you voted to make me rebuild, Sarah finished for him. Yes, that's correct. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 30 seconds before Henderson spoke again, his voice much smaller than before. Mrs. Mitchell, I swear to you, if Karen had told us about your daughter, nobody would have voted for that resolution. But you did vote for it, Sarah pointed out. Without asking any questions about why I might want to remove the pool, without considering that there might be reasons beyond property maintenance for my decision. We thought... Karen said you were just being difficult. She said you'd been fighting HOA regulations for years, and this was your way of getting back at the board. Sarah felt a familiar surge of anger, but this time it was mixed with something else, a cold satisfaction at watching Karen's lies finally catch up with her. Mr. Henderson, in the 3 years since my daughter died, how many times has the HOA filed complaints against me? Well, there were the lawn citations, and the hedge trimming notices, and the mailbox painting requirement. 17, Sarah interrupted. 17 separate violations in 3 years. All for minor maintenance issues that any reasonable person would have overlooked given the circumstances. Your board has been harassing a grieving mother for 3 years because Karen Pemberton convinced you that my depression was a threat to property values. The silence on Henderson's end was deafening. What do you want from us? He finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. An apology, Sarah said without hesitation. A public apology to every resident of this neighborhood, acknowledging that the HOA overreached its authority and explaining exactly why you demanded I rebuild a pool where my child died. And Karen Pemberton's resignation from the board, effective immediately. I don't know if Karen will agree to... I don't care what Karen agrees to, Sarah cut him off. Those are my terms for settling this lawsuit quietly. If you want to fight it in court, you'll be explaining to a jury why you thought it was appropriate to torture a grieving mother. Your choice. Henderson hung up without another word. but Sarah knew her message had been received. More importantly, she knew it would be passed along to every other board member within the hour. The second call came 20 minutes later. "This is Lisa Morrison from Oak Street. I was at the emergency meeting, and I need to understand what really happened here." Morrison was the HOA secretary and generally considered one of the more reasonable board members. If Sarah could turn her, the rest would follow. "What would you like to know, Mrs. Morrison?" "Karen told us you were demolishing the pool to spite the neighborhood. She said you were trying to create an eyesore that would hurt everyone's property values. She never mentioned anything about your daughter." "My 5-year-old daughter Emma drowned in that pool 3 years ago," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the pain that still accompanied those words. "I tried to live with it, thinking someday I'd be able to look at it without seeing her body, floating in the water. But I couldn't. Every day, looking out my kitchen window was like reliving the worst moment of my life." Morrison's sharp intake of breath was audible through the phone. "The pool removal was never about property values or HOA regulations," Sarah continued. "It was about my ability to heal from the worst trauma imaginable. And Karen turned it into a weapon to continue 3 years of harassment that began the day I became too depressed to